Why is it inevitable that the Falcons are going to cut Kirk Cousins in March? Let's break it down on today's Locked On Falcons.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Atlanta Falcons for a very long time, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that go strong with me as everydayers. And that means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we are talking all about Kirk Cousins and the, as I see it, inevitable release that will be coming next month in March. And we'll focus on sort of why I think that is. And by the end of today's episode, hopefully you guys will at least understand where I'm coming from when you hear me say it's inevitable, even if it isn't necessarily guaranteed that it's going to play out that way. And the way that we'll do that is we'll spend a large portion of today's episode not really talking about what the Falcons do with Kirk Cousins because of what the Falcons want to do with Kirk Cousins, but what the other 31 NFL teams will kind of force the Falcons to do, in large part due to not necessarily facilitating that trade. But basically, since December 18th, the night that the Falcons benched Kirk Cousins, and we did that live show reaction to it here on Locked On Falcons, I basically said then that he would be a post-June 1 cut for the Falcons in March. And I don't think anything has really changed in the last 8 weeks since that night. I don't think a whole lot is going to change over the next 5 weeks until we get to the point when the Falcons need to make that decision. And that deadline is due to the fact that Kirk has a roster bonus in 2026 that is due on March 16th of this year, that a $10 million roster bonus that is due in 2026 becomes fully guaranteed on March 16th of 2025. And, I think the Falcons are, will try to get something done before then, right? In terms of Kirk Cousins, like March 12th is when the new league year starts and free agency officially kicks off, right? That the legal tampering period begins on March 10th. But that March 12th deadline is when teams can designate a player as a post-June 1 cut, which basically means if a player gets cut in March, his contract gets treated like he was cut in June. And that matters because if you cut a player on or after June 2nd, up until the end of the season, that dead money that incurs, bonus money and all that stuff gets spread over 2 years instead of one. And that matters for the Falcons because the dead money that they have to pay on Kirk Cousins is the remaining guaranteed money, right? They have 65 of the $90 million that is unpaid on that guaranteed money for Kirk. And that doesn't include that $10 million roster bonus as of yet. It will on March 17th. So on March 17th, it'll be $75 million that they owe to Kirk out of 100, not 65 out of 90. But if the Falcons make Kirk a post-June 1 cut, they'll only have to pay 40 of that $65 million this year and then 25 next year. And if they hold on to Kirk after March 16th, it'll be 40 this year and then 35 next year. And by the end of today's episode, again, the goal is for you guys to understand why it's a sort of, at least I see it as an eventuality and an inevitability, even if it wasn't, I can sit here and say with 100% certainty it is going to happen. Because I think when you look at it from a Falcons fan perspective, you say, hey, man, we would love to trade Kirk Cousins because that would basically unload $27.5 million of that $65 million in guaranteed money that you are owed, or that you owe. And you would only have to owe the remaining $37.5 million. That $27.5 million is Kirk Cousins' 2025 base salary that is fully guaranteed at this stage. And so if you are able to successfully trade Kirk in the next month, you would have to pay that $37.5 million upfront right now in 2025 as dead money. If you manage to trade him, say in June of this year, you would only have to you still owe the $37.5 million, but it'd be split. It'd be $12.5 million this year and then $25 million in 2026. And so financially, there's every incentive for the Falcons to trade Kirk Cousins at some point. The problem is Kirk has a no trade clause in his contract, which means Kirk would have to agree to the trade in order to waive that no trade clause in order to make that trade happen. So you just can't go trade Kirk to anybody that you want. He's got to want to go there. And that's really where I think the challenge of today's episode, for those of you listening and watching, is to sort of take off your Falcon tinted glasses when it comes and look at, the potential of trading Kirk Cousins, not from the Falcons perspective, which, as I just laid out, the team has every incentive to want to happen, but from the other 31 NFL teams that might, would need to want to make that happen in order for that trade to happen, right? Take two to tango and whatnot. And so, if I ask you as a non-Falcons fan, now that you are, and I'll take off my glasses just to illustrate the point, right? And you guys can be weirded out by how I look without glasses. But if you're one of the other NFL 31 teams, now that you're not a Falcon fan, do you want Kirk Cousins, right? At least in 2024, you could make a decent argument, as I did on this podcast, that betting on Kirk Cousins coming off the Achilles, coming off the season he had, given the circumstances, it's a worthwhile bet. Maybe not as the price that the Falcons paid, but still a worthwhile bet. Can you make that same argument in 2025, given now all that's happened to Kirk since then? But you probably sit there and say, "Oh, Aaron, NFL teams show that they're desperate for quarterbacks all the time." And it's like, you're right, but not for the types of quarterbacks that Kirk Cousins is currently, right? We see teams desperate for young quarterbacks in the draft, right? They reach on quarterbacks all the time. They reach on a 21, 22, 23-year-old guy because they can convince themselves that guy could be potentially the savior of the franchise, the next Michael Penix, the next Lisan Al-Gaib. Teams don't get desperate for 36-year-old, soon to be 37-year-old quarterbacks like Kirk Cousins when he turns 37 in August, right? And one of the things I've done over the past week is look at every quarterback trade that has happened over the past decade, right? There have been 60 quarterbacks traded over the last 10 years, 56 separate trades. 4 of those trades involved, two quarterbacks swapping teams. And when I look at all 60 of those trades, I go like, how many of those teams that acquired a new quarterback won their trade? Air quotes, won their trade. Maybe 7, right? One, I would say, is the Jets acquiring Ryan Fitzpatrick in 2015 to be Geno Smith's backup. Geno got punched in the face, broke his jaw that preseason, and Ryan Fitzpatrick took over as the starting quarterback. And that's been the only winning season that the Jets have had in the last 14 years. Number 2, I would say the 49ers trading for Jimmy Garoppolo in 2017. That was a win for them. Number 3, Washington trading for Alex Smith in 2018. Only because Washington was in playoff contention with Alex Smith until he suffered that horrific injury in that Texans game. So it didn't work out long term, but at least you could convince yourself that, if not for an incredibly unlucky break, no pun intended, that they were on the path for that winning that trade. Number 4, I think you could say the Saints won the Teddy Bridgewater trade when they acquired him to be their backup quarterback in 2018. And in the following year, Bridgewater won 5 games as a replacement starter for Drew Brees being hurt, and that kept that team in playoff contention. And so, as far as backups go, that's basically exactly what you want as a backup. So I'd say that's a win for the Saints. Number 5, I would say the Ryan Tannehill trade to the Titans in 2019, who was traded to be insurance and backup Marcus Mariota and wind up taking that job and leading that team to multiple playoff years. And then 6 and 7 is the Stafford Goff trade, right? Where you can say it worked out for both of those teams, probably more for the Rams since they won a Super Bowl, but the Lions have suddenly become a contending team rather than a joke of a team that they had been for a long time prior to that trade. So wins for those 7 trades, but that's 7 out of 60. That's barely above 10%. And then when you look at 3 out of those 7 successful trades, though were primarily the goal was to get backups and insurance policies, right? Fitzpatrick, Bridgewater, Tannehill were backups. Were expected to be backups, not the starters. So you've only had 4 successful trades where a team was, basically said, we found our starter over the last decade of quarterbacks. And by my count, there have been about 20 total trades where I think the team traded with the idea of we found our starter, but only 4 of them actually worked out for that team. So that's about a 20% hit rate. And I point this out because we constantly hear about how the NFL is a copycat league, but teams in general, not always, but in general, do not copy things that don't work. And if I'm sitting here telling you that there's an 80% chance that trading for a veteran quarterback is not going to work out, is that really incentivizing other teams to copy that formula for success? Because it's not really a formula for success, right? And to me, you saw this happen a couple of years ago where the league kind of adjusted, right? In 21 and 22, you saw a bunch of teams trading for starting quarterbacks, right? It's basically saying, like, we're going to get our own Matt Stafford, right? And, very few of those trades outside of that Stafford Goff trade went belly up, right? Carson Wentz got traded in 21 and 22. You saw the Matt Ryan trade, Sam Darnold, Baker Mayfield got traded. You saw Teddy Bridgewater get traded to the Denver Broncos, basically to replace Drew Lock. And Teddy Bridgewater was solid that year in Denver, but that led them to, it wasn't good enough to basically say, we're not going to trade for Russell Wilson the following offseason in 2022. You saw the infamous Deshaun Watson trade. And so after 2 years of a bunch of teams trading quarterbacks thinking, hey, we got our new starter, and most of them not working out, you've seen the last 2 years in 23 and 24, teams have been less reluctant trading for quarterbacks. You've only really seen one trade in the last 2 off seasons where a team was like, we found our starter. That was Aaron Rodgers to the New York Jets, right? And we've seen 11 quarterback trades outside of that Rodgers trade the past 2 off seasons. So it's not like teams have stopped trading quarterbacks, but they've gone back to what most of these trades were, which is we're trading backup quarterbacks on rookie deals. You saw all the quarterbacks, or most of the quarterbacks from the 21 and 22 draft classes get traded, including Desmond Ridder, right? The veterans exceptions are Josh Dobbs getting traded twice and Taylor Heineke getting traded by the Atlanta Falcons last summer. And that's the norm for most of these trades, that basically, roughly half of these trades, of these 60 trades that I'm talking about over the last decade, have been basically backup quarterbacks on rookie deals, right? And only 3 out of those 60 trades involved someone trading for a quarterback that was 36 years old or older. That was Joe Flacco in 2021 when he was traded by the Eagles to the Jets to be Zach Wilson's backup quarterback, Matt Ryan in 2022 when he was 36 years old, and Aaron Rodgers in 2023. And so I sit here and I go, if you're an NFL team, if you're not the Falcons, guys, I want to stress it. We're not Falcon fans on today's episode. This is Locked On the other 31 NFL teams today. You understand that this is the history of these trades. What incentive is there for you in the year of our Lord in 2025 to make a trade for a 36-year-old Kirk Cousins? There really isn't one. And so if you are going to copy anybody in regards to Kirk Cousins, you're hoping that the Falcons cut him, not trade for him, right? Because you're trying to do what Pittsburgh did with Russell Wilson, where after that disaster, Broncos cut him. He signed for very cheap, veteran minimum with the Steelers, and they were able to make the playoffs with Russell Wilson, right? That's something other teams can say, oh, that's a formula that works. We can copy that, right? We'll run the football. We'll play great defense, just like Pittsburgh did. And we can get Kirk on a cheap 1-year contract to be that bridge starter for us. And maybe that'll work. Maybe that'll get us to the playoffs. But trading for him, not so much. Now, again, trading for him is possible. I'm not sitting here saying it's an impossibility. I'm just saying it's very unlikely. And I'm not sitting here saying it won't happen, right? I've made some bold declarations on things that wouldn't happen on this podcast in the past. And I've been wrong like twice on it. And that's 2 more times than I should have been. And so I know enough to not sit here and say it definitely won't happen. Just like they definitely won't sign draft Michael Penix in round 1. They definitely won't go after Deshaun Watson, those types of things. So when it comes to quarterbacks, it's like, well, some things sort of unpredictable tend to happen. But I'm just sitting here saying, like, I'm not saying it definitely won't happen. I'm just sitting here saying the odds, I think, are very much lower than I think people realize. I think a lot of people probably think, oh, there's like a 40% chance to trade Kirk Cousins. And I'm here to tell you, that number is probably closer to 4%, and that's probably being generous. And so we'll see what happens over the next 5 weeks. I'm not going to expect it to happen in these next 5 weeks, and I don't think you should either. I'm sure there will be a lot of rumors and buzz and reports and all these various tweets that are suggesting, movement is happening, negotiations are happening, and you're going to be like, Aaron, is it happening? Is it going to happen? And I'm like, probably not. But we'll see. I'll be here the whole time, right? We'll be talking about it when new stuff happens. Like, does this move the needle in terms of a Kirk Cousins trade becoming more likely now? We'll see. But again, I'm going to sit here and tell you that, I think it's going to be a lot of smoke, but not a lot of fire behind it. But we'll see on that front. So we'll continue today's episode talking about, this move and why it's inevitable that the Falcons are going to cut him. But let's do the dance and let's talk about the other 31 NFL teams, or at least 7 of those teams that sitting here today probably don't know who their week 1 starter is going to be. And so those are the teams that if anybody's going to trade for Kirk Cousins during these next 5 weeks, they would be it. And so we'll ask, if those teams will pull the trigger on a Kirk Cousins trade, and we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So football season may be over, but basketball season is in full swing, and there's no better way to stay in the game than with Prize Picks, the best place to play daily fantasy sports. And with Prize Picks, you just pick more or less on at least 2 player stat projections. And if you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash. And Prize Picks gives you great ways to win. I know I didn't necessarily win my main bet with Prize Picks for the Super Bowl, but I found some ways to hedge, so it wasn't a complete loss. And that's the beautiful thing about Prize Picks. There's so many different ways to win, right? You can pick more or less on points, rebounds, assists. You can combine points and rebounds, steals and blocks, points and assists, all of the above when it comes to the NBA. And of course, you got to love the weekly promos like Taco Tuesday, where you can get discounted player projections for even better value. So download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5. Prize Picks, run your game. So I think there are 7 teams right now in the NFL that I would say currently do not know who their week 1 starter is going to be. That's Tennessee, Cleveland, the Giants, the Raiders, the Jets, the Steelers, and the Saints. Those are the teams that I think realistically could be calling the Falcons for Kirk Cousins, or really 6 of those teams, because I think we can eliminate the Saints right away because they're either going to have Derek Carr or a rookie starting for them at this stage. They can't. They got to restructure that Derek Carr contract. So we'll see on that front just to get under the salary cap. I think we can also eliminate the Jets from that consideration because, they've been there, done that with Aaron Rodgers. So I don't think they're going to be like, oh, we're going to trade, it's going to work with Kirk Cousins. I think Pittsburgh could have interest in Kirk, but with 2 pending free agents like Russell Wilson and Justin Fields, I don't think there's really any incentive for them to trade for Kirk Cousins, right? If they're going to spend money on a quarterback, just pay one of those 2 guys. Now, if Kirk is cut, maybe they would revisit that conversation if they can get Kirk on the cheap. Cleveland is the team that most people seem to be connected, but I'm skeptical of that because, they have that Kevin Stefanski connection. That's obvious. But financially, it doesn't make a ton of sense for Cleveland, right? They're currently about $30 million over the salary cap, according to overthecap.com. They could free up about $35 million by restructuring Deshaun Watson, what they certainly are going to do. That puts them $5 million under, but then they would have to free up at least another $22 million in order to facilitate a Kirk Cousins trade. And they could do that with other moves, but that would basically require the Browns to basically say, our roster is good and we're a quarterback away and we just need Kirk Cousins and that will solve all our problems. But if you watched the Browns last year, it wasn't just the quarterback play. They couldn't really run the football. Their offensive line struggled. They lacked weapons. Their defense took a massive step backwards. Basically Myles Garrett and Denzel Ward and JOK, and that's about it. They're in no position to sit here and say that they're a quarterback away, which is why Myles Garrett wants out of that situation. Not to mention that the Browns theoretically could find cheaper options than Kirk, right? They could get Joe Flacco. They could get Jacoby Brissett, 2 guys that have had quasi success in Cleveland recently, right? Do you spend $27.5 million on a 36-year-old Kirk Cousins, or could you spend like $2 million on a 40-year-old Joe Flacco, or $5 million on a 33-year-old Jacoby Brissett, right? And given their finances, I think those 2 options are going to be, preferred over going after Kirk Cousins. Not to mention, they also have the number 2 overall pick. All right. And so if they like whoever the quarterbacks are, they could just draft a quarterback and boom, solve that problem. So, if Kirk does get cut, I certainly think he now becomes a serious part of the conversation and potentially changes the math. But at this stage, I would guess Kirk is at best plan D for the Cleveland Browns. Now, if he's cut, maybe he could shoot to be plan B or something like that. But a trade up to that point, I don't think it's realistic. Tennessee, since they have the number 1 pick, kind of takes them out of the conversation, right? Even if they don't love this quarterback class enough, I don't think Kirk Cousins is going to be their plan B. Like, maybe Sam Darnold is their plan B or somebody like that. So again, Kirk Cousins, I don't think is going to be high on their priority list to facilitate a trade. The Giants, it's like, all right, you got rid of Daniel Jones. Again, they're picking 3rd, so maybe they're not in the QB sweepstakes if quarterbacks go 1-2 in this draft. But if you're Brian Dable and Joe Shane on the hot seat, you're going to go to ownership and be like, yeah, paying Daniel Jones was a mistake, but if we pay Kirk Cousins $27.5 million and trade for him, that definitely isn't a mistake. So I have a hard time buying that. The Raiders, right? Could they say, hey, we done the Jimmy G, Gardner Minshew, Aiden O'Connell thing? We're ready to buy in on Kirk? Sure, I guess, maybe. But, I think the Raiders want a long-term solution at quarterback, not another bridge option. And if they are going to go with a bridge, given the hiring of Pete Carroll, I would guess they would look at Russell Wilson. They would look potentially at Seattle, give Seattle a phone call and say, hey, is Geno Smith available or whatever, rather than trading for Kirk Cousins. So these are the reasons why when you start breaking it down, it's like, who's trading for Kirk Cousins, right? Again, Kirk Cousins isn't likely to be anybody's plan A or plan B. He may be a plan C or plan D for certain teams. And again, that does not incentivize teams to trade for the Falcons in that regard. So, you're probably sitting there going, well, Aaron, couldn't the Falcons take on money in order to sort of grease the wheels in order to facilitate a trade, because the acquiring team wouldn't have to acquire all of Kirk Cousins' $27.5 million guaranteed base salary? That's possible, right? But the problem is that if the Falcons take on more than $2.5 million of that $27.5 million, they're losing cap space, right? If they trade Kirk in March, they'd have to pay $37.5 million and thus save about $2.5 million against this year's cap from Kirk's original $40 million cap hit. Now, if they take on more than $2.5 million, Kirk's going to count more than $40 million against the cap, right? And so say they took on $12.5 million of Kirk's $27.5 million. Sure, that would mean the acquiring team would only have to, get Kirk for $15 million. But that would mean the Falcons would have to take on a $50 million dead money hit. And is it worthwhile to lose an additional $10 million, in cap space just to probably pick up what is probably amount to be a late round draft pick, a special teams player in terms of the draft compensation that you get, as I outlined on yesterday's episode? Probably your best case scenario is a 5th round pick in this year's draft if you trade Kirk. So while I think that's an option, I don't think the Falcons are going to kill their cap in order to facilitate this trade, right? It's not really going in basically, unless the Falcons are willing to kill their cap in order to make this trade happen, which I don't think they are, it's not really going to change the math for an acquiring team and make them more likely to acquire Kirk. Could they do a restructure of Kirk's contract? Typically the way that the NFL works is that you have to trade a guy and then the new team can adjust the contract. But, I don't know exactly the rules are, but is it possible that the old team could adjust the contract and then trade a guy? It's possible. I think that's technically possible. I can't think of an example where that's happened. So it would be, at least based on my understanding, pretty unprecedented. And maybe the reason why it's unprecedented because the NFL doesn't allow teams to do that. But let's, for a second, assume it is possible. The challenge with that is you got to get all three parties on the same page, right? You're going to need, the Falcons, the acquiring team, and Kirk to be all on the same page. You got to get that rework contract, right? The trade compensation. You got to get Kirk waiving that no trade clause. And at least when it comes to at least traditional restructuring, so maybe there's some exotic restructuring that the Falcons could do that I'm not aware of, but at least the traditional ways would either require Kirk to take a significant pay cut from the guaranteed money that he's already set to get paid, which there's really no incentive at this stage. Maybe there will be at a later date for Kirk to basically not take $27.5 million that he's owed. Or B, it would require the Falcons to take on significantly more dead money either this year or next year than they are currently set to make. So there's really no incentive for the Falcons or Kirk to agree to this weird unprecedented three-way sort of thing. So it's hard to imagine a win-win-win for all three parties, Falcons, the Kirk, and his new team. But, there are plenty of scenarios where two out of those three entities are happy, but not all three. And so that sort of unprecedented move of reworking the contract and then trading Kirk, to me, is very unlikely, but we'll see. So I again stress that a trade of Kirk is very, very unlikely, not impossible, but very, very unlikely given what we know. And that kind of leaves the Falcons with, I think, their final two options, which is either to keep Kirk or cut Kirk. And I think it should be fairly obvious that the Falcons aren't keeping Kirk, but let's break it down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So when the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on that action than with FanDuel America's #1 sports book. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. So even if you miss the opening tip-off and want to bet on that fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on that action. We know all about that action, boss. So if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same game parlay. That's the beautiful thing about FanDuel, man. You can bet on, Trey Young and Zachary Ricochet and Dyson Daniels and, all these new players that the Hawks have added all in one bet, right? To maximize your enjoyment of the next Atlanta Hawks matchup. And of course, take advantage of that opportunity right now, because if you sign up at FanDuel, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today or download the app. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So now we're talking about the Falcons. So I'll put my glasses back on. I know you guys are weirded out by it now. Keep or cut Kirk. So is there any reason to really keep Kirk? Well, all things being equal, sure, Kirk would make a great backup quarterback for Michael Penix. The problem is that Kirk has stated multiple times that he has no desire to be a backup quarterback. Now, he hasn't said it out in blunt language, like, I do not want to be the backup quarterback for the Atlanta Falcons. But all the statements of, I haven't forgotten how to play quarterback, I think I have a lot of good football in me, is basically him saying he has zero intention of being the backup in Atlanta. He played nice for the last 3 games. He's not going to play nice for the next, 3 months or whatever it's going to be. So, you hear that and then you say, but Aaron, didn't Terry Fontenot say in his year-end press conference that the Falcons are comfortable with keeping Kirk as a backup? And I say that's Terry saying the thing that he has to say, right? Because of the possibility, again, not the likelihood, the possibility of a trade, right? We outlined why a trade is very, very unlikely. But if you're Terry, as we outlined, you want to trade Kirk Cousins. But no team is going to trade with you if they know you're going to cut a guy. They will not negotiate in good faith. And so if other teams know you're going to cut a guy, there's no incentive for them to give you a decent offer, right? They can constantly lowball you. They can say, okay, well, if you want to trade Kirk Cousins, we'll give you a 2027 conditional 7th round pick that that the conditions will never be met, because it'll be like Kirk Cousins has to throw for 50 touchdowns in 2026 or something like that, and it's like, oh, that's not going to happen. And then, like that sort of situation. So Terry has to say we're comfortable keeping Kirk, because, it's a negotiation ploy to tell the other NFL teams that if you pick up the phone and call us, we're not just going to give him away for whatever, a pack of cigarettes and, a roll of toilet paper or whatever you think is the low end trade or whatever. So, we all kind of know how it's going to work out in the end, but you got to kind of play the song and dance between now and then, right? If they wind up cutting Kirk, you got to do this song and dance. And so that's really what that was all about. And so, there's really no incentive for the Falcons to hold Kirk Cousins hostage. If he wants out, you're not going to sit here and spend the next several months answering questions about Kirk Cousins. No one wants that, right? If Kirk is still on the team in June, what are people going to be talking about? They're not going to be talking about the bright future of the Atlanta Falcons with Michael Penix. They're going to be talking about the bizarre quarterback hostage situation that the Falcons have going on. It's going to take up all the oxygen in the room. And again, nobody wants it. Terry doesn't want that. Arthur Blank doesn't want that. Raheem Morris doesn't want that. Zach Robinson doesn't want that. Michael Penix doesn't want that. And certainly Kirk Cousins doesn't want that. So basically I sit here and I say, unless a trade happens between now and the start of the league year, you're almost certainly going to cut him, right? There's really no reason not to cut him than just to sort of move on, right? You're not going to save any money against this year's cap, right? You'll save a little bit of money against the next year's cap, relatively speaking. But you can just kind of move on, right? You can avoid that $10 million that you potentially is due for him in 2026 and just take the L and move on. It's kind of what everybody wants. Again, no one wants to take the L, but it's kind of what it is, right? All the money is a sunk cost at this point in time. There's no reason to devote more money towards Kirk Cousins at this point in time by keeping him beyond March 16th. And so to me, that's why I sit here and I say, like, they're going to cut him. Right? Like, we're going to play the song and dance. We're going to talk about it. We're going to, they're talking to this team and do all this stuff. But at the end of the day, everybody knows they're going to cut him. Almost everybody I know that covers the NFL professionally thinks they're going to cut him. Almost every NFL insider seems to think that they're going to cut him. But, we got to play the song and dance and be like, well, it's possible something could happen. So I hope now, guys, after hearing that for the last 30 minutes, you understand why, I'm treating this as an inevitability. I'm treating this as the eventual outcome, even if, I can't say for 100% certainty that this is going to be how the Kirk Cousins saga ends, right? We could get a different outcome. It's possible, but I'm just sitting here telling you, don't hold your breath on a different outcome coming. So I'm sure plenty of you have many thoughts on this matter, and I'm sure there are other angles that we can take and talk and discuss. So I look forward to reading your comments here on YouTube. I look forward to the Locked On Falcons insiders that can, tell me what they think, right? And if you want to become a Locked On Falcons insider and not only get, what's the word? Priority. For some reason I was thinking incentivize. My brain is not working, guys. Too much time thinking about Kirk Cousins. If you want to get priority on future Q&As and mailbags, as well as access to all the film breakdowns that we do, we have a DB one coming out later this week. You can become a Locked On Falcons insider at the link in the description below. In the link in the description below, you can join the conversation in the Locked On Falcons Discord. And of course, you can always send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com as well. So look forward to all your feedback on this very subject. But again, why it's inevitable that the Falcons are going to cut Kirk Cousins. I'm sure I'll probably write something about this over at the Falcoholic at some point, later this week or later this month as well. So there you guys have it. Again, not the last time we're going to be talking about this, but just want to put all my cards on the table to make you guys understand why, I sit here and say, like, they're going to cut him. But hopefully you guys have a better understanding of that, whether you agree with me or not. So that is going to do it for us, guys. We'll be back with more mailbag questions potentially on tomorrow's episode. Make sure you continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. And if you want to get the, download from the Locked On NFL, Super Bowl, everybody's reactions, what's next for all these teams, of course, Locked On NFL is going to have you covered. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.